Welcome back to the podcast Unbinding the Bible. This is a by the book episode, a conversation with Dan Kent. And on the podcast today, I am going to be having a conversation with the author of the book Confident Humility, How to Become Your Full Self Without Becoming Full of Yourself. And this is a book that I came across actually less than a year ago. And so this one is very recent for me. And for those of you doing the math, that means that, yes, I in fact read this book while doing the podcast. And so I love books like this that hit me at particular times, even while I think I am doing the hard work of unbinding the Bible. Along comes someone like Dan, who quite frankly unbinds it in 15 more ways than I ever thought possible. And Dan is winsome. He's funny, he's gracious, he's compassionate. I spend a lot of time listening to a podcast that he has, and we'll talk about that briefly on the show today. But so it feels like I've gotten to know him over the hours of just listening to his interactions. But like I said, is very thoughtful, very eager to engage, very eager to help bring people along in his thought process. And Dan has a way of digging deeply into passages, things that I've never seen. And so hopefully it'll be an encouragement to you. Hopefully you will wrestle as he introduces us to true humility and compares it and contrasts what Jesus teaches about humility with both what we understand to be pride as well as what we understand to be shame. And Dan does a fantastic job of helping us walk this very fine line between not elevating others above ourselves and not elevating ourselves above others. And I keep a journal on the side just to help me keep straight all that's going on in my mind. And I have copied entire pages of Dan's book into my journal, charts and paragraphs of thoughts, because they have gripped me so powerfully in helping me navigate my own way through both shame and pride. And so as a pastor, but as a Christian, someone who just wants to faithfully follow Jesus and be able to move past the world where we tend to compare and contrast ourselves with other people non-stop, Dan's book is a breath of fresh air. And so I offer to you a conversation that is fun. We laugh, we have a good time together. But Dan, I hope, will be able to communicate to you, and you will hear the heart of a person who wants to see people walk in the freedom that we actually have in Christ. And so I offer to you this conversation I had with Dan Kent. Welcome back to the podcast, Unbinding the Bible listeners. I am really excited about today's episode. We have a by the book episode, an interview with Dan Kent. And Dan is the author of Confident Humility, Becoming Your Full Self Without Becoming Full of Yourself. And I would like to credit Dan with the most creative, clever, and brilliant subtitle to any book that I have ever read. I absolutely love that. And it automatically creates conversations with those I share the book with. And hopefully you'll get to hear Dan explain very clearly why he's chosen that title. But Dan is also the author of the series, The Training of KX12. He preaches as the teaching pastor at Woodland Hills Church in Maplewood, Minnesota, and he also hosts and produces Renew's podcast, Greg Boyd, Apologies and Explanations. You can follow Dan on Facebook and on Twitter, and I'm just really thankful to have him on the show. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Joshua.
Yeah, this is so great. I was just talking to Dan a little earlier that I've came across his book, Confident Humility. And the only reason I came across this book several months ago was because I tune into the podcast that Dan has with Greg. And Dan, I just want to ask you, what is it like working with Greg Boyd?
It's amazing. It really is. I mean, he is everything that you hear on the podcast. He has that energy. He has that depth of knowledge and the ability to just call forth like brilliant answers. And um, it's not a show. I mean, he really is that way, and he really is that caring, and he really is that. He's not obsessed about money. He's not obsessed about anything other than communicating the message of the centrality of Jesus and the fact that God is revealed fully on the cross. That really is his driving passion, and it's an honor to work with him. I've known him since the '90s. I went to college at Bethel when he taught at Bethel University in the '90s, and so in fact, I was mentioned in Satan and the Problem of Evil in one of the footnotes, and
Oh, were
which was
you?
like, yeah, I mean, I was just out of college, and I just felt like it was like the greatest academic achievement of my life. And then I knew him. I went to his church, and we were in like these discussion groups together, and I was his friend Paul Eddy's first teaching assistant, and so Paul Eddy is sort of like my mentor. But I kind of knew Greg for a long time, and then I proposed the podcast with him in 2016, and even up to that point, Joshua, after at that point, what, like that point was 20 years of knowing him, he still would call me by my last name, Kent. He didn't really know my first name. So he knows my first name now, and I'm happy
Yep.
about that. So
That is
yeah,
wonderful. Wow, that's
yeah,
hilarious. And
he's
yeah,
he's he's a treasure. He really is.
that's great. Well, and it comes out. I mean, I've listened, to both of you in sermons that you've preached on your podcast as well from the church, and just listening to and reading his books, and then reading your own. You both have been treasures in my own life, and so I'm really thankful to have you on this show,
Mm.
just to talk about your book, and I'll make a link to it so others can read this along if they wish. Um, but for you listeners, Dan and I have never met really, other than reading his book. I feel like I've gotten a little glimpse, but I thought it might be a good place to start. For Dan, if you would just tell us a little bit about yourself, some things that you think would be important for us to know, and then how maybe in a sort of a trajectory, how that might help pave the way for some of the events in your life that led you toward writing this book just a year ago.
Yeah, that's great. You had mentioned in the previous what's, I think you said I'm going to be your number two interview, right?
That's right.
So
Yeah.
it would be 2 episodes ago, I think, when you introduced this series about interviews. Uh, you had mentioned C.S. Lewis and how your wife had encouraged you to read some books, actually read them cover to cover, and I think that was very wise of your wife, by the way.
Yes. Yes.
And you had read Chronicles of Narnia, and then you kind of got into it. You got the fire for reading it, and then you read some of C.S. Lewis's other books. That's sort of the same thing that happened to me, in a similar sense. I grew up, and I'll talk a little bit about my growing up, but I grew up, basically atheist. Just had no access to religion other than what I saw on the TV evangelists, and kind of stumbled into this youth group because there was a girl there that I thought was cute, and I had fun there. And then I sort of, like, I would listen, and I was very compelled by the whole religion thing. But the church I was saved at, they were not very intellectual. They didn't, like, if you had questions, that they didn't really deal with questions very well. They were very, very much about just, you just have to have faith. And but they were very loving and just a wonderful church community. But there's one guy there, Greg Gray. He's like, I think this is what you want right here. Why don't you read this? And he gave me Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And
Yeah.
at the time, I was a high school student. I had a D minus average. 1.3 was my GPA.
Wow.
And but I mean, I would like do all sorts of stuff. I would like read books, and I would, I've been writing since I was like 12. And so I just didn't care about school, though. I liked my own stuff. But when I read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, it's like I instantly fell in love with learning, and I just started devouring everything I could find. And so that led me to college, which led me to meeting Paul Eddy and Greg Boyd. And at that time in college, I had a friend, a very, very dear friend. Her name was Jessica. She had died of cancer, and so I was just like obsessed with the problem of evil, because I was just starting to get this taste for God and this fire for God. And then all of a sudden this happens, and then now all of a sudden I don't know if any of this makes any sense. And I really wrestled through the problem of evil with, the help of C.S. Lewis and with Greg Boyd. And I mean, talk about a lucky. I had no idea how lucky I was as a college student
Wow.
to
Yep.
to be able to just hang out with Greg Boyd. I just didn't. He was just a professor to me. I don't.
Yes.
You know. And so that's sort of kind of got me into Greg Boyd's theology and this kind of cruciformity theology and this open theism theodicy. And but what had happened is, I had grown up with with my mom, and um, we went to this church, and not only were they not very intellectual, they just didn't care about the intellectual stuff as much as the emotional stuff and the kind of passion part of the faith.
Yeah.
Um, but they also had a very negative view of human nature, and it wasn't always explicit, but it was always the undertone of everything, like whether it was in prayer or whether it was in poems or whatever. It was always something about my own smallness, my own depravity, the wretchedness of my sin, and just kind of the more dramatic you could decorate your smallness, the more spiritual points you got in that community.
Oh boy.
And
Yep.
yeah, and I just had a hard time with that because it just seemed like everything that read about Jesus, everybody's happy to be around him, and they feel like wretched people, and the fact that Jesus was one of these people, it just didn't really click with me, and it just seemed off. But I didn't really have a solution to it because the theology seemed to make sense, but I carried that nagging weight with me. And then on top of that, this is in the early 90s, and the self-esteem movement is just going crazy throughout the country, and everybody is talking about how important it is to tell kids how special they are and how wonderful they are. And so the school was saying that, you are wonderful, you're great, you're special, and my church was saying you're nothing, you're depraved, you're miserable. And it's like, which one do I believe? I'm getting pulled in two directions here. And that really kind of it nagged me because my mom, she had me when she was 14. She was pregnant when she was 13, and and she hustled to raise me. I mean, she raised me on her own without even a junior high education, and
Wow.
she worked double shifts, and she was gone a lot, and I ended up kind of learning a lot about life on my own. But when I came to this dilemma, like, how do I view myself, it's such a fundamental question, and it affects so many other parts of my worldview, that it really did seriously nag me in a deep sort of way. Uh, and and then when I got to college, I'm wrestling with the problem of evil stuff. I'm in this Life and Teachings of Jesus class with Professor Herzog, and he gives everybody a word that they have to do a paper on, and the word I got was humility. And which I was not happy about. I was hoping for like sanctification or atonement.
Yep.
But I got humility, and that's when I studied Matthew 23, and like, it just clicked. It just made sense that Jesus also disagrees with these two perspectives, the ditch of smallness, I call it, and the ditch of bigness, this idea that you are fundamentally bad, or this perspective that says you are fundamentally good. Jesus in Matthew 23 seems to be saying that they're both fundamentally flawed. And that's sort of a history that leads to the writing of the book.
Wow. Well, and that's thank you so much. That was a
Yeah.
very succinct and very clear presentation of the history. It's so funny because I think if I had been assigned the word humility, I probably would have started, Philippians chapter 2 or something, or don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but think of yourself with sober judgment. But what's funny is I would have applied those verses and my understanding of those verses to how you define team smallness.
Yeah.
This view that we really are so small in comparison to God. And it was always framed as the way to really honor God is to express to him how much less than him you really are.
Yeah.
And that's my context. And so reading your book, every page was filled with, oh, wait a minute, this is very different. So how did you arrive at Matthew 23 um, to for this study? Because I know that chapter, Dan, but I've never seen what you saw there.
Yeah. Well, you know how it ends, the pericope, which I just love that word. the the
Yes.
chunk the chunk of
Yes.
verses that ends with those who don't humble themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
Yes.
He just kind of, it seems like this just jumps out of nowhere, like this has nothing to do with what comes before. And so I wanted to figure out, why did Jesus say that there? And then as I was looking at more closely at that section of text, I'm like, oh my gosh, he's basically unpacking his view of humility here. And uh and so uh, you're right. In fact, Professor Herzog mentioned the Philippians 2 passage because he did not like my paper. He's like, no, this is not where
Mm,
you go for humility. Where you want to go is to the Apostle Paul in Philippians. And right away I'm just like, "Nah, I think I'm onto something, because
yep.
why would you go to Paul if you could go to Jesus first?" That's what
Yes.
I was thinking.
Yes.
um but and so when you read that section of text in Matthew 23, the first thing that jumped out to me was the fact that yeah, Jesus agrees that the Pharisees are prideful. And what happens, like all of the books I read on humility, from theologians, from Christian theologians, they all seem to have the same understanding of humility, that humility is the opposite of pride.
Mm,
And
right.
which makes sense intuitively, because you can't really imagine a person who's both prideful and humble.
Right.
But it still seemed flawed, because what happens with that is that if you think that humility is only the opposite of pride, and you agree that humility is good, well, then the only way to get more humility is to get more anti pride. And the only way to get more anti pride is to continue to degrade yourself more and more and more. And
Yes.
that just leads to this downward, I call it a race to the bottom, where you're constantly trying to one down yourself and one down each other. And it's just dysfunctional.
Yes.
Uh, and so what
Well,
I see in Matthew 23 is like, yes, Jesus agrees that pride is bad, and he totally chastises the Pharisees for their arrogance. But then he says, hold on a second, let me grab my Bible.
yeah. And while you're grabbing that, Dan, while you're grabbing that, you had said on page 27 of your book, I just wrote down a few notes here. It says, those trapped here get tangled up in an absurd pursuit, chasing excellence at being devoid of all excellence.
Yeah.
And that to me was a very good point. I mean, this is so funny. That was my life
Mm,
for
wow.
many, many, many years. And so we'll get into that more, but this is great. I think you're really framing it well for us right out of Matthew 23.
Yeah. Um, Here, let me. Oh shoot! I'm looking at the wrong book. Greg Boyd has encouraged me, or challenged me. He's challenged everybody, but I've accepted the challenge to use my Bible more and not use my Bible app. And
That's
it's
great.
good. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. It is. And so, but I'm a little
I'm a
rusty. Here it
I'm
is.
a book guy. I've got to have the Bible or the book or whatever in my hand. I can't do the Kindles and I can't. Yeah.
Mm. Well, we'll have to talk about that.
Yeah, you
Uh,
have to convince me. So,
Yeah, yeah. So in Matthew 23, he says this. He says, "But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have only one master." Okay, so right there, Jesus is agreeing that you should never let people exalt you like the rabbis are exalted. And then he says, "And you are all brothers." And then he says this, and this is where it suddenly clicked: "Do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one father and he's in heaven." So he's like, not only don't let other people exalt you, but also don't put other people above you. And
wow.
so yes, the Pharisees are just dysfunctional in how they think they're better than others, but equally dysfunctional is people who put themselves way below others, and who actually think of themselves below others. And so Jesus here is saying both of these are dysfunctional. And so immediately what I realize is that my intuition that the ditch of smallness and the ditch of bigness, there's something wrong there. That's what Jesus is saying. The ditch of smallness and the ditch of bigness are both flawed. And so I think that and this is true too. If you talk to any psychologist and say, hey, what's the opposite of pride? No psychologist worth their salt is going to say humility is the opposite of pride. They're all going to say the opposite of pride is shame. And so it's no
Mhm.
wonder that Christians historically, in trying to pursue humility, ended up nurturing all of these shame dysfunctions, because what they were really doing was amplifying shame, not humility. Humility, as Jesus teaches it here, I think is it's the opposite of both shame and pride. Whatever it is that creates shame and pride, humility is the opposite of that. Uh, the example that I use in the book, I think, is from James Kellenberger, and he said it's like pacifism. You could say that pacifism is the opposite of winning a war, or you could say that pacifism is the opposite of losing a war, but you wouldn't say that pacifism is like a balance between winning a war and losing a war. It's just against war itself. War
Right.
is this thing that creates the victors and the losers, and pacifism is against all of it. And in the same way, whatever it is that creates shame and pride, humility is the opposite of that.
Yeah. Well, and when I read that example, you take it out of its normally thought about context and you place it alongside it. And I think you even had arrows, up and down, pride,
Yeah.
shame, no, humility is this thing that is separate from them. And so, this may be getting us right into the next section, but can you talk to us about then what is going on
Mm.
in the
Yeah.
team smallness that is afraid of pride and team bigness that is afraid of shame? What is that thing that humility is really, getting at the opposite of?
Yeah, I think. Well, the first thing, let me say this first before
Yeah.
I jump to that, is that I think the foundation of what Jesus is saying, because team smallness says that we are fundamentally bad, team bigness says that we are fundamentally good, and you see that throughout philosophical history. These two sides debating about the fundamental nature of humanity, and what Jesus ultimately says, I think, is that we are fundamentally neither. We are not fundamentally bad. We are not fundamentally good. What we are fundamentally is loved by God. That's our
Mm,
fundamental nature. We are
yeah.
fundamentally loved. Goodness and badness is sort of like this opportunity that we have to, God places before us blessings or curses, life or death. We have these opportunities to become more hardened or more soft toward God, but fundamentally we're neither of those. We're just loved. And that to me was sort of like that's what unhinges this seesaw, this up and down, this shame and pride from humility. It's just a different economy there.
Absolutely. Yeah, you had listed a chart in your book. I don't remember. Maybe it's chapter 3, but the chart is on page 72 in your book. But you just listed it there, comparing team smallness, team bigness, and humility, and then you emphasized, you are what in each of these categories, bad or good or loved, and you got to a section, according to team smallness, are you trustworthy?
Yep.
And team smallness says no. And then team bigness says, well, of course you're trustworthy. And humility, Dan, when you wrote the word in unproven,
Hmm.
it was a weight that just lifted from me because
Hmm.
I had been buried under all of the past selfish and controlling and fear-based decisions and actions and ways that I had hurt people, and thinking I'm growing in sanctification, right? The word you wished you had gotten for your paper,
Yeah, yeah.
growing into Christ likeness, but all it was doing was reinforcing my badness. And it
Hmm.
was reminding me on a day-to-day basis, man, you're never going to get this figured out. And the frustration was, then I think I'm coming back to the gospel, which is reminding me that, Jesus took care of it for me so that I don't have, but it was not setting me free from the
Hmm.
bondage that my very life was. I was going around in circles, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So those charts, I've copied those into journals. I've got them just in front of me and they pop up all the time because
Hmm.
they're liberating.
Yeah, that's really neat. And that make the unproven part there. It is. I mean, you look at the Old Testament, especially. You have Moses and Abraham and all of these characters who God was testing. Um, he was testing them because they were unproven, and
Hmm.
so, but they weren't fundamentally good or fundamentally bad. They were unproven, and so God tests them, and it's just such a fundamental part of the whole Christian story is that God uh, gives us say so, gives us power, gives us ability. He lets us live, and then he comes to test us to see what have you produced. Um and and so, from an open theist perspective, of course, there's something there that he wants to learn. And
Yeah.
and to
Yeah.
me, that's motivating. To me, that's inspiring. That's like, you know uh, that gives me a charge. So yeah, but that's cool. Thank you for sharing that. That's I love hearing that.
Well, and it's really funny too because since C.S. Lewis introduced me to reading, I have been trying to read everything I can get my hands on, and growing up in the team smallness place, and I think you coined the term, Dan. I'm not sure if estimating is a real word, but maybe it
Yeah,
is, and if it isn't, it should be.
yeah.
But that's what your chapter 4 was about, and basically esteeming people as more important, or not more important than yourself, which we're encouraged. Like we want to see this in people, but almost
Mhm,
elevating people to a place of greatness and grandeur. And it was funny because I tend to do that with authors. I tend to
mhm,
say, here's a person who has a published book. They've got something to say. And then I said to myself, I'm going to interview these people, and they're brothers with
that's
me
right.
and
Yeah.
sisters. And I want this to be a regular conversation. So I'm not trying to, you know, puff you up, but I find myself qualifying my statements because I grew up in a context that said if I did do that, it was always only bad. You can't do that to other people. But
Mm,
man, just getting
mm,
caught in that system of being able to say, how is it that we can, be loved by God and stand in that? And so maybe this is circular, but it sounds to me a lot, Dan, like identity is what you're really getting at
mm.
in the book. And so how do you what's your framework for understanding Christian identity?
Well, there's a lot of dimensions to it, I would say. I mean, there's so many things that uh, the Bible kind of declares about our identity as Christians. That we are ambassadors for God. That God throws a party when one of us repents, and all of that kind of stuff, and that God is seeking us, and that God is waiting patiently for us, and that we are God's beloved child, and all these types of identity things. But I think really that chapter on estimating sort of gets at the maybe the metaphysical foundation of our identity, and you see it in Matthew 23 too, because when he says, I turn the page, here it is, when he says, you are not to be called rabbi, for you have only one master. So basically Jesus is saying there, don't let other people put you above them. And
Right.
then he says also, don't put other people above you. Right between that, right between the don't be above people and don't be below people, he says, for you are brothers and sisters, which I think is Jesus's way of saying you don't put people above you or below you because you are all equal.
Yeah.
And so what he's saying is that uh, shame and pride are lies, because shame says that you are inferior to others, and pride says that you are superior to others. And Jesus says you are neither of those. You are fundamentally equal, which means that shame and pride are fundamentally false. Equality is this reality that we are unaware of. We've all been nurtured in this narrative that some people are better than others, and what Jesus is saying is that's not the case. That's a delusion that you have
Yeah.
to work yourself out of. And in that way, what's really fascinating, and this is what I talk about in the estimating chapter, is as opposite as shame and pride seem, really in the most important sense, they're exactly the same thing. And what I argue is that if you look at two people, and I have Ernst and Fremont are my people,
Yes.
you have Ernst, who he has all of these attributes. He's got dandruff, he's got goofy teeth, an annoying laugh. He's kind of pudgy. He's got debt, all these things, and he just kind of feels ashamed. He doesn't feel very competent or effective as a person. And then you've got Fremont, who's got perfect hair. He's got a great smile. He's got a good what is it called? Uh, Credit score. He's got six pack abs,
Yeah.
and he feels like pretty much a prime specimen of what a man can be. He feels
Yeah.
great, but so they feel the opposite. One feels pride, the other feels shame, but they're using the exact same formula. They're using the exact same math formula. They tally up these attributes, and then they look at the result, and then they plaster that result on the core of their being. And but so even though they come to opposite conclusions, the math is exactly the same, and it's that math that's based on a delusion that Jesus is going after, and it's the delusion that some people are better than others. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and it's a delusion, and I call it a delusion because for two reasons. One is it is a delusion because Jesus says the reality is you are all brothers and sisters, but it's also a delusion in that it operates just like delusions do. And I spent 20 years working in mental health with schizophrenics and psychotic patients with bipolar, and so I've been with a lot of delusional patients, and you notice that the self orientation of people who are delusional, just the self-centeredness, and that's the same with the delusion of inequality, I call it. uh, as soon as you think that some people are better than others, you can't help but start obsessing about where do you stand. If some people are better than others, that means there's a hierarchy. That means that I'm somewhere on the hierarchy. Where am I?
Mm,
Am I high on the hierarchy? Am I low? And how do I move up? Or if you grew up in the Christian tradition, how do I move down?
right.
It's, and so it's very much like a delusion in that way, and also like certain things just take on all of this importance, and uh, like I had a patient who would come in and she just would be constantly drinking water, and the reason we found out later that she was always drinking water is because she thought her organs were on fire, and she was trying to keep her organs from igniting. Um, and then I had another guy who he wanted to wear his baseball hat, even though there were no hats allowed, and he would just be, on the psych unit, and he would just get really angry if we wouldn't let him use his baseball cap. And so finally we said, all right, fine, we'll go get your baseball cap out of the locker, and we realized that it had tinfoil lining the inside, and so he wanted the hat because of the tinfoil. And what you find out is that, as strange as those behaviors are, once you understand the narrative that they're living in, they make sense. You understand,
Wow.
if you really think your organs are on fire, you're going to be drinking a lot of water. And if you think that the government is trying to control your thoughts with satellites, you're going to want something under your hat to protect yourself from it. And so then suddenly these strange behaviors, they make sense. They're still strange, but at least they make sense. And the same
Wow.
is true with the delusion of inequality. As soon as you I mean, why do people obsess about themselves so much, and about, you see people who are pretty healthy and in good shape but still just obsessing to get a little bit lower body fat,
Yep.
and
Yep.
just like this, just like, oh my goodness, so much effort and sweat and toil to just get a little bit better body fat. And that makes sense when you view humanity as a competitive hierarchy. um, those behavior, and Jesus chastises the rabbis for it right here in Matthew 23. He says, look at these guys, look at them. They wear these big dumb boxes on their head, and they've got these big long tassels because they really think that means something. These guys
Yeah.
think that it means something that they have big phylacteries on their face, and that they've got these long, look at that, isn't that funny? And Jesus recognizes how strange that is. To the Pharisees, it wasn't strange at all. That's what you do, because they're not even aware that they're living delusionally.
Wow. Well, then that explains why this book was so profound, because you're somehow beneath the surface. I would say in a shame pride world or an estimating world, you're kind of, the best we can do is say, now don't do that, don't think that or don't act that way or what. And it's these external behaviors, but if the narrative isn't changed,
Yeah,
we're just going to replace them with a different
that's
a
right.
different narrative. Yeah, like you said,
Yeah.
it's the exact same rules. And those are some of the insights that when I hear them from the outside, or I say this is going to radically change the way I view myself,
Mm.
the way I view other people. And honestly, what it's done is it's transforming the way I'm even reading scripture and understanding my own calling as a Christian.
Wow.
Because what you're doing, I don't know if team smallness and the avoid pride at all costs world, I don't know if that lends itself to individualistic Christianity, or if I just happen to be a participant in both team smallness and individualistic Christian. I don't know that I have the insight to make that connection, but I will say that what you're getting at is allowing us now to touch on social dynamics
Mm.
and community dynamics without even trying. You're saying if we strip all of this stuff away, and you've got your what are your two guys' names in your book again?
Oh, Ernst and Fremont.
I got to hand it to you. I mean, who else comes up with names like let me give you my two examples of Ernst and Fremont. But
Well,
there's
you know
this
why I did that is because I wanted names that you don't see a lot, you know? So
and you nailed it. If your publisher didn't tell you to do that, you did it yourself. But on page 170, and I'm not sure even what chapter that's on. I'm looking at the book here, chapter 9. But you list really small print, but just a rather extensive list of some of the positive attributes of a person or things that a person could be embarrassed about
mm,
within themselves. And then you make this very simple, it's so clear, Dan, but I
hmm,
don't think it had connected with me prior to reading this. But how you say we tend to get down on ourselves because we have these like body fat, right?
yeah,
Or we're socially awkward, or our skin color isn't exactly the way that we would want, or we get anxious in difficult situations. But then you go right down to the next chart or the next list and it says, well, yeah, I've actually got a great memory and I'm actually a fairly disciplined person. And so you say, well, am I elevating all the weak things and am viewing myself through that lens? Or am
yeah,
I elevating all the great things and viewing myself through that lens? And just to stare at this list and think, oh, goodness, I actually don't have to be identified by any of those things, but
yeah.
I'm free to strive to improve in all of those areas without ever losing my identity at the same time.
That's right.
That was
Yeah, well,
profound.
and yeah, and I have to give I didn't have a good way of giving credit, but this is that whole that's in the tools section of the book, and
Okay.
that's actually something that I sort of modified from cognitive behaviorism. This
Wow.
tactic, but yeah, what happens is, you know, when you're in shame or when you're in pride or if you're living in this estimating delusion, this delusion of inequality, certain things just get like elevated, and sometimes they make sense, like, you know, you just elevate people who are smart, who are just like very intellectual, or maybe you elevate people who are physical specimens, or whatever it is. There's just certain things, and some of those things get ridiculous. Like the one that I make fun of in the book is some people just lose their mind over how weak or strong a guy shakes their hand, you know.
Wow.
It's like, who cares how strong a handshake is, you know? But
Right.
but when you're living delusionally, like I said, certain things just take on all this importance, and you see how ridiculous that behavior is when you recognize all of the potential attributes a person can have, and you realize, you know, why am I fixating on one little constellation when there's 30,000 stars up there? It makes no sense to why I'm worried about one dim star when I've got a whole galaxy of bright stars.
Yeah.
And it is a very helpful kind of tactic that I kind of developed out of cognitive behaviorism. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
so I
well,
can't take credit for that.
I do imagine, and I'm not even sure I know what cognitive behaviorism is, and maybe you could explain that for us. But I would say that your 20 years working in mental health, that can you talk to us just for a
Yeah.
couple minutes about that? I can't help but think that a lot of that is you're able to peel back layers that maybe lots of other people aren't able to see things like you do.
Hmm. Well, you know, the work I did in behavioral health is, originally I was sort of a hospital counselor, but what you find out in behavioral health is when you take on those types of roles, if you become a therapist, you end up working a lot with what's called access to disorders, and so there's two in the DSM, which is sort of the collection of disorders for mental health. There's two types of disorders. There's Axis 1 and Axis 2, and Axis 1 are things like schizophrenia, which are just like, they're so biochemical that there's not much you can do other than medicate, you know. But then the
Okay.
Axis 2 disorders are personality disorders, and a lot of times those are not as biochemical in nature. They're really more like, uh, destructive tactics that people have developed in order to kind of deal with life. And what you find out is that when you go into counseling, most of your patients are access to patients, and so they're manipulative, they're draining, they kind of feed off of you, they're kind of very parasitic, and so after a year or two in mental health, I decided I want to get away from access to patients, because the average burnout rate working with access to patients is 3 years, um, just because that's how draining they are. And so I started working with schizophrenics, and with schizophrenia, there's nothing, you can experience a lot of the delusional behavior and the hallucinating behavior, but eventually you start to notice that these are all very similar, and so you don't really get. It's not like there's layers of knowledge there. All of the knowledge I got was from my own research. Like I would carry big books around with me all the time, and people would say, "What are you in school right now?" And I would, for a while I would say, "No, I'm just reading this, and because I want to learn about cognitive behaviorism." And then suddenly they would tell me about everything that they know about cognitive behaviorism, and then eventually I just said, "Yeah, I'm in school," just to make it easier.
It's just
But
easier.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I loved working in mental health, but the role that I did in mental health was mostly, I mean, I'd play ping pong, and I would talk with people and break up fights, and get punched and stuff like that. That was mostly what I did in mental health.
Wow. My
But
goodness. So and then how many years you said you did that for 20 years?
yeah, up until last fall when I took the position at Woodland Hills Church, I was working just part time, but writing this book. I worked on this book for a long time,
Okay.
and then you know during that time I worked part time in mental health, and yeah,
Wow. Yeah, I just think overall the ability to look into situations and to see, even as you described the patients there with the delusions, and yet once you understand the narrative,
yeah,
then their delusion makes sense. That was so insightful, honestly, because I don't without much knowledge about delusional people, you kind of just, well, they're a little bit out there, and you
yeah,
sort of move on. And I think what's so refreshing about your book is that it, in a truly gracious way, it invited the reader, it invited me into believing that I also have delusions,
hmm.
in a way that was, first of all, very inviting. I mean, I hope I'm open and eager to learn new ways in which Jesus has literally come to set me free. But that's what I
Right,
felt like as I read the book, because it's not just I'm forgiven of my sins, now I can go to heaven when I die. That's not the great news. Jesus has literally come to free us from everything in this world that leads to death. And quite literally, the shame train that I had been on for so many years of my life. Um, and I want to get towards your idea of confession and conflict and competition here just in a little bit, because I think
hmm,
that was very liberating for me as well. Um, but I don't know, Dan. This is I almost feel like I don't know how the best way to even express it. But let's just jump into that. Is that all right? Can we jump into
yeah.
the?
Well, let me just say, you were talking about oh yeah, yeah, definitely, man. The stuff on equality and recognizing the fundamental nature of our equality. If you think about it this way, if you think about the fact, I think Second Corinthians 5 says that Jesus became our sin on the cross, which Greg
Yeah.
Boyd has said that basically, if God is perfect holiness and sin is everything ungodly, that means that God became the antithesis of himself on the cross, which means that
Mm,
God could not have gone further for us, which means that God could not express greater love for us than what he did on the cross. And if that's
yes.
true, that God did that for me and God did that for you, that he couldn't do anything more, that means that he loves you more than he could possibly love you. But he also loves me more than he could possibly love me, which means that fundamentally we are equal, because if he loved me more, then his love for you would have been surpassable. And so if God really loves each of us with an unsurpassable love, that means that we are unsurpassably equal. And the more I've kind of grown into that, and the more I've looked into that, and kind of in my own spiritual walk, the more I've wrestled through that, I feel like that's also very much like, I can't remember how you phrased it, but like waking up to a delusion, I think you said.
Yeah, that's right.
But you said it very well. And then also now, and this is not in the book, but you had also mentioned individualism, and I'm learning how my own individualism has affected my faith, and so there are all of these layers of delusion, but this one on equality just really strikes me to the core. I think that this is very fundamental, because
Absolutely.
because the reality of equality is sort of the antidote to the delusion of inequality, to the up and down, to the shame and pride, and like you said, what happens if you don't understand the reality of equality, and if you don't understand this teaching that Jesus has, eventually what you're going to do is you're just going to oscillate between shame and pride ad infinitum till the end of days, because what happens is you go down this path of smallness, and that has all sorts of consequences in people's lives that leads to shame, and shame causes all sorts of dysfunction, sexual dysfunction, addictive dysfunction. And so then society gets to the point where they're like, forget shame, we need to go the other way. And so they end up fostering arrogance, and that has its own set of dysfunctions and oppressions, and that causes all sorts of problems, and that cycle just continues, and people go back and forth. And you really need this third perspective in order to get out of that hamster wheel. And so, yeah, that's all to say, I agree.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, and hamster wheel is a great way to put it, because if the so I will use myself, if a conservative Christian perspective, which is kind of where I grew up in, if they answer to the world's arrogance is, be ashamed of yourself, then it's this strange, we're fighting dysfunction with dysfunction and
Yep.
expecting functionality to surface, and it's, which again is a delusion, but it's so well, I don't know if I'm using the word right, but it feels humbling in that sense, to, or maybe humiliating is a better way to say it, that we are very complicit in dysfunction, and when you're in that, you don't know you're in that. And that for me is kind of the point of my podcast in general. Our listeners know that if they've been with me a while, is that I'm trying to unpack things in Scripture that we think we understand, but maybe we've not been looking at them in the
Mhm.
right way. And so again, that's why your book is so great. Can I read a quote there from your book?
Yeah, let me first affirm that. I was going to
Oh,
affirm
sure.
this earlier. I love you were talking about how, well, don't we just need the Bible? And I think that sentiment is, the concern behind that sentiment is that we're going to place these other books above the Bible. But I think what you were getting at, which I absolutely agree with, and I support 100%, is that no, the Bible is the most important thing. But what the Bible does is it forces us into community, and it forces us
Yep.
to find out how other people are reading it. And I tell you what, I did a sermon this weekend on the book of Ruth. And what I try to remember to do is I try to always remember to go to the woman's Bible commentary to see how they make sense of whatever passage I'm looking at. And
Wow.
and 95% of the time they show me something that I just did not see, that's
Yep.
clear as day, but because of who I am, I filter it out.
Yep.
And so that's kind of the advantage of having this series of interviews with writers, is that they might not be right, and there's and I'm sure I've got all sorts of flaws here, but together I think that we can offer each other things that eventually gets us closer to truth. And so, man, I love what you're doing with this podcast. Keep it up.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. My wife picks on me a little bit from time to time. I'm trying to teach through Revelation. Revelation is sort of the cesspool where every dysfunctional interpretive technique lands, and it just gets mixed up with every other one. And so, I found myself over the last 9 months trying to go through it and trying to strip it away from maybe a premillennial dispensationalist interpretation where the secret
Yikes.
rapture shows up. Oh yeah, which was my context growing up, and yet I never fully understood how that made sense. And so anyway, we're walking through the book, and I'm taking forever, and I sort of apologize, and I sort of say, I'm trying to work it out. I'm trying to work it out in my own life, and I happen to have, you know, 80 to 100 people who are listening in to me work it out, and that's
Yeah.
kind of what we're going for. But you're right, because we are only one perspective. And
Hmm.
I've been saying for a while now, this has been a new thought to me. Sadly, I'm a pastor. This ought to be an old thought, but we speak a lot about a person's relationship with Jesus. And
Hmm.
then we don't treat that relationship like we treat any other relationship. We don't realize that my relationship with you over the last 45 minutes on the phone is vastly different from your relationship with Greg and your relationship with your wife and your relationship with the members of your church, even though you're the same person. And
Yeah,
I'm like, Jesus is the same person, but I'm not the same as you or my
that's
wife
right.
or this guy. And so why do we create these umbrella ideas? You all have to look at him and think of him in the exact same way. And it doesn't mean that we're going to have these wildly and different interpretations. What it means is that he's going to relate with us how he made us. And
Mm.
that is a liberating thought to me, because I read your lists, these really lengthy lists. And Dan, I'm telling you, less than 6 months ago, I'm 41. So for the first 40 plus years of my life, less than 6 months ago, I was still grasping and pawing. I did not like the person that God made me to be. I
Wow.
saw so many things in myself, these estimating things, but things that I did not like. And I could not get past, why did you make me this way? To the point
Mm.
where I would want to wish you, I'm a real strong feeler. In my marriage, for instance, my wife is an Enneagram 5. I think I heard you said you might fall into that platform as well. I'm a 4, but
Mm.
she's a logical thinker. She's an INTJ on the Myers Briggs. I'm a feeler. I tip the scales in the feelings category. And so all of these stereotypes I grew up with, I kind of embrace one that's a bit more feminine, and
Mm.
she's got the stereotype that's a bit more masculine. And I'm telling you, you put that concept into a shame based team smallness, and it is a
Yeah,
recipe for a disaster. And
totally.
you may not see it on the outside, but internally, I was a disaster. And
Mm.
so just to be able to be set free from those internal struggles and know that Jesus has deeply loved us and knows the flaws, knows the weaknesses, and
Mm.
meets us there as we are and says, "Come with me. I'll be right
Yeah.
here with you," is just beautiful.
Hmm. Man, that's great. Hmm.
Yeah. So let me read this quote you had on page 133. This kind of gets right back to this inequality. You said, "So for the humble, for those not suffering under the delusion of inequality, the outcome of any given performance has little relevance to and no effect on our security." And as we come to really see this, to really believe it, a great deal of anxiety dissipates, leaving us with far more mental space for things like concentration, creative responsiveness, and emotion regulation. This in turn helps us perform better, and a better performance will thereby increase our confidence all the more.
Hmm.
This idea that performance is irrelevant has another advantage. If we really are invulnerable to all these external things, then we can also look at our failures openly and without apprehension. In day to day life, we no longer have the need to deny weaknesses or hide vulnerabilities. And she who can fearlessly face her own weaknesses will have a far easier time overcoming them than she who denies them. Dan, that is beautifully said. Would you like to comment on that section, even though you wrote a whole book on
Yeah, that's right.
it?
Yeah. Oh, hey, this is in the chapter on confidence, and so the book is called Confident Humility. And so it wasn't until 75% of the way through the book that I finally started talking about confidence. But yeah, that's what happens is when you believe that some people are better than others, when you're stuck in that delusion of inequality, then everything you do takes on this secondary meaning. It's not just, I think in the book I use playing the violin as the example. You're not
Yeah.
just playing the violin, you're also proving how important of a person you are by how good you play the violin, or you're
Mhm.
trying to establish your status by how well you play the violin. And that has nothing to do with violin playing. That's just this extra, 100-pound weight that you strap to your face as you try to play the violin. But when you realize that none of this playing the violin really matters in any important way, and the more you can grow into that, the more you can just take that weight off of you and just play the violin just for the fun of playing the violin. And without that weight, you free up cognitive resources to just focus on the task at hand, to just playing the violin. And uh and so that's sort of the point of that passage. And then finally, if you believe that your performance matters to your like status as a person, to your inner core, then you're going to there's a lot of dysfunctional things you could do. You could obsess about your performance because there's so much at stake. You could deny that you have weaknesses because it just hurts too much to look at them, or because if people don't know that you're a failure there, well, maybe you can kind of squeak by,
Yep.
because in your head the success at this really matters, and so you can't tell people about these failures. And so there's always just that perpetual latent anxiety about all the things that you do. But what humility teaches is that we are all brothers and sisters. There is that inequality is a delusion. You no matter how good you play the violin, it's not going to make one little bit of difference. You could be Yo-Yo Ma, and it's just not going to matter in terms of your status in God's creation. It might give you some worldly opportunities, and it might
Sure.
give you you might score a date with somebody that you want to have a date with, but it's just it's not meaningful in any long term thing. I always look at these musicians who are so good. I mean, they're just like profoundly skilled, and they just have this raw talent. And I'm thinking of like rock musicians from like the 90s, and how many of those guys overdosed and killed themselves, you know?
Mm,
And
yeah.
like they realized that even though they had this profound talent, it they still killed themselves. It wasn't enough. There's something more that was more important. And there's so many people who just they're striving to be good musicians like that and good singers, and they still think that it really matters, and they don't see all the counter evidence that it doesn't matter. and
Yeah.
and the more you can grow into the reality that it doesn't matter now, in any deep way, the more free you are to just, instead of looking at the world as this testing ground for how effective of a person I am and where do I land on the hierarchy, you can just look at the world as a playground. I'm doing this just because it's fun to do. And that's so freeing. And really, it for me personally, it allowed me to overcome my fear of speaking in front of others. Just realizing that it doesn't really matter how well I do. It's just I want to teach this stuff. I care about the content.
Yeah.
But see, when I was going in to teach, I was 25 when I taught my first class in college, and it was Intro to Psych, and it was there was 75 students in there, and I just thought, man, that's a lot of eyeballs. And I remember before I stepped in, I kind of reminded myself of this stuff. And what I did was I just said, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to prove to them what a great teacher I am? Because if I'm doing that, I'll never win. That's a losing battle. That's estimating.
Yep.
That's just a
Yep.
losing battle. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go in and share with them what I know about psychology. That's all I'm going to do. I don't care what they think of me. I just want to make sure that they understand the psychological stuff. And what I found was, you know what? That's all they cared about too. What does this guy
Yeah.
know about psychology?
Yeah.
And by me providing the thing that they cared about, they ended up liking me as a teacher too. And so it ends up being a win-win.
That's right.
And that's sort of what I'm getting at in that section.
Absolutely. And it's funny too because we will estimate people, place them up on a pedestal and strive for those limited characteristics about them that we can see.
Yep.
And what they've done a masterful job, if they're playing the game that we're playing, is that they've hidden the weights and the burdens and the failures and the weaknesses that they think nobody would be able to stomach. And
Yeah.
so they're carrying that on the inside. And that's the trade-off we don't see, is we don't know, like you said, as sad as that is to look at such gifted musicians and then to hear the tragedies that they've overdosed on drugs because the internal battles are not alleviated. Rest
Yeah.
is not found in all of these performances. And yet that's a delusion that is a hard nut to crack,
Hmm.
because it seems so apparent. Well, if I had tons of money and if I had so much influence, I mean, and I see the same things creeping, I would say creeping into the church, or maybe they're already there in the hearts of the people. It's hard to say which one is which, but even within Christian organizations or churches, knowing that I mean, we could still fall in love with a celebrity culture within a church and want to
Oh
attain
gosh. Yeah.
greatness. I mean, and well, I guess I have to say that's true. It's not, it's not a
Yeah.
question of maybe, it's a question of absolutely,
Yeah.
um,
Totally. Yep.
and then, but, but being
Yeah,
able,
it's funny.
go ahead.
It's funny, like the podcast I do with Greg. I mean, Greg is just, he's got a following.
Yes,
He's sort of like a Christian celebrity, And I
sure.
remember recording this podcast with him just starting off. We'd only done it for like 6 months, maybe 9 months, and then we had this Renew conference, and him and I like go over there, and we're in his neighbor's garage recording these episodes, and Greg is just spastic. He's, I think he's got like he's wearing two different pairs of shoes on his feet. They're mismatched, and then we go to this conference, and someone's like, "Oh, I got to get my picture taken with you. I listen to your podcast all the time," and it was like, really? It's just,
Wow.
it's
Yep.
just me and Greg, and
That's
and
right.
it's weird, and it's hard not to do that because you listen to somebody so much, and this is totally a rabbit trail, but
No,
I think that there's something to it where you have a you have an interpersonal deficit with somebody where if you listen to them or watch them for 100 hours, let's say, you suddenly have 100 hours worth of interpersonal debt because you have taken in all of this stuff from them, and so you know them on such a deeper level, and so you go to them knowing them on that level, but they have no idea who you are, and there's like this awkward sort of
Yeah.
imbalance there. uh,
Yeah.
and yeah, so whatever. That's a total rabbit trail, but
Well, no, and that's the reality though. And I felt that. I mean, I have gone to conferences in the past. If we're talking about, we can, we don't have to deny weaknesses or hide vulnerabilities, right? I mean,
right,
I was that guy. I would go up to speakers or authors or both or whatever and just, oh, you've had such a, and just gush all over them. And
right,
of course, in my mind, what's so weird about that is that I was in my own delusion, I was posturing myself humbly before them,
mm,
when in reality, I'm doing us both a disservice.
that's right. Yeah, I think
and
that's right.
yeah, and so it's just, I think for me, it's been fun, but it has been very, stopped me in my tracks. How many times in the last several years now Jesus has kind of arrested me at a certain point and has shown me, you've been looking at this all wrongly. You've been
Hmm.
looking at this all wrong. And he does it so graciously. But
Hmm.
I approach him with just, okay, I've read the gospels for so long. I think, I want to see myself as this weak one that you've come to save. But in reality, Jesus, I'm pretty sure there are some places where I'm the oppressor in this
Yeah.
relationship. Would you show me the ways in which I've actually been oppressing other people. And he so kindly just walks me through it. And then I feel like what you did when you read the woman's theological perspective on the book of Ruth, because all of a sudden you're getting commentary on the exact same situation you've just been studying, and it's nothing like what
Yeah.
you thought. So
Totally. Yeah.
I love
Mm,
those.
mm,
And I will tell you that reality was happening over and over while I was reading your book. And
mm,
I I have spent the better part of 30 years in a shame filled prison, I think is a better way to put it. I don't talk about this a lot, and it's not that I'm afraid to, but in the spirit of vulnerability and weakness, um, I had a good friend, my cousin actually, who framed this in the best way I know. But she the words she uses, and this explains my story, is that when I was a kid, about 8 years old, I had I had what I would like to call an unwanted sexual experience.
mm,
That has, in being able to look back, has radically shaped my life for over 30 years. And
mm,
only in the last year to a year and a half have I been able to bring that into the light, maybe if we use some of Jesus's language in John, to where he's able to actually help us deal with the things that we're afraid to bring out into the open, and to begin to go there with it. But ever since doing that, it's like he's been filling hidden spaces in my heart and embarrassed places in my life and places of weakness and powerlessness and prison. He's been filling those with his presence and his light and his instruction and his grace. And every single day, I'm not quite there, but I'm almost to the place where I say, where else can you show me areas that I've been wrong in so that I can see your grace and your light in new ways here? And he's
mm,
doing it. And it's just great.
mm.
It's
That
just
is
been
really
great.
great. That is really great. Uh, you know, thank you for sharing that. By the way, when I was a little boy, I had a couple kind of weird sexual things also that
Hmm.
nothing too traumatic, but
Yep.
it was pretty borderline. And those things they can stick around for a long time.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right. And then of course you live in a shame based area, or team smallness, have you
yeah.
do. And those were the things
Oh,
I just thought, well, that is not something I'm going to bring up,
that's right.
especially in my church context, and those are I feel for people personally in churches. Of course, as I said, I'm also in a church. Our church is much smaller than yours, but when I look at real lives and real places, um, I see people are in bondage. They're afraid to be known. They're
Mm,
afraid to open up because they're not sure, again, if is the person I open up to also playing the estimating game, and are they going to
yeah.
snub their nose at me and wonder why I'm not, I don't have my life together. And
Mm,
but I wanted to see if and maybe this ties in a little bit. I guess bringing things into the light is some of the way I think about confession. Those are,
mm,
at least that's the language that's gripped me at the moment. But you, at the end of that quote I read, you talked about, she who can fearlessly face her own weaknesses will have a far easier time overcoming them than
hmm.
she who denies them. And then you gave, I just, if I can read another little section, I know
Please,
it's
yeah.
it's funny reading it to the author, but I'm reading it for everybody else. So on page 167, you talk about confession, and in a page before you
Mm,
say, um, you know, I'm a sinner is not a confession, it's a philosophy, which is just brilliant because that's absolutely true. But at the top of page 167, you say this: consider these two prayers. Prayer A: Lord, I'm a hopeless sinner. I am nothing, desperately wicked and a pathetic stain on your great creation. And then prayer B: forgive me, Father, for my recklessness with money. I blew my entire paycheck on new clothes. I get a little cash and I seem to lose my mind. I get stressed, then I buy things, and it never seems to help. And then you wrote, if these prayers were from two separate people, which person would be easier to help? Which person could we offer advice to? Which person could we offer measurable goals to? The obvious answer is person B. There is nothing to be done for person A. And I think when I read the last state, there's nothing to be done for person
Mhm.
A because, like you said, I think at the very beginning of our talk, that's kind of like the heightened point. You become experts at, or how did you put it? Chasing excellence at being devoid of all excellence. That's how you put it on page
Mm.
27. And I just think you can't do anything with that. Now,
Yeah.
now we sit back and we applaud you because you've made the greatest confession you can make as a Christian. Now what?
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, any thoughts you have more about the
Well,
the
well,
confession part?
yeah, I think confession is so important, and you look in the Bible at how people, we make choices, and then eventually our choices make us, and we
Hmm.
become these people. We don't even know how we became these people anymore because the choices are so subtle, and eventually we get to the point, like the apostle Paul says, where I do the things that I do not want to do, and the things I want to do I can't. And I think it's in John. He says, 1 John, we deceive ourselves, and then eventually the truth is no longer in us.
Wow.
And the antidote to that, I think, is confession. The antidote to not having the truth in us is to confess what we're doing wrong, but not just confession, because I mean, it has to be real confession. It can't be things that the church often calls confession, which is sort of the "I'm a terrible person" type stuff.
Sure.
Real confession that's helpful is not about me. It's about the behaviors that I'm doing. What am I doing wrong? It's only when I get specific, when I take out all the global claims about myself and I get specific, that now I can see what I'm doing, and I can make plans, and I can try different things. And but yeah, what happens is both of the ditches end up sabotaging our confession, because the ditch of smallness, they think that we're so terrible and we can't do anything good. We're nothing. Um, Basically, you couldn't have done otherwise. I mean, you're just, confession becomes more like you're describing yourself. You're not really confessing anything. You're just saying, "I am a horrible sinner. Here's what that looks like." You're not saying, "This is what I did wrong." You're saying, "This is what a wrong person does." And it's only when you believe that you can do something, that you have real say so, that you can confess to the specific things that you do, and make a plan about it. Now, the ditch of bigness tends to thwart all of this in the opposite way. They tend to say, uh, I am wonderful. I'm great. I don't really have anything that I have to confess, because I am just good enough the way I am. I'm fundamentally
Yeah.
good. Yeah, I might sin here and there, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm fundamentally good. And what happens for Christians in the ditch of bigness is that they I think this is speculation on my part, but I think what happens is they take this idea that God loves me, uh, with such a profound love, that I must be profoundly good. And because
Wow.
as people, we tend to love things that we think are good. I love
Yep.
chocolate chip cookies because I think they're good. I don't love Brussels sprouts because they're bad. And so that's how we love things. But God loves in a much more profound way. He loves us while we are still sinners. And so this idea that if God loves me with such a profound love, I must be profoundly good, is not true. He loved us while we're sinners. He loves you as a sinner, but because he loves you, he expects so much more from you. He expects you to continue to grow and to wrestle with the sin in your life. But both of those ditches end up sabotaging confession that's useful, confession that details what I did wrong, details why I think I might have done it, and then maybe offers some ideas for how to overcome that. But when we're in the ditches, it's hard to get confession like that.
It really is, and I think part of it is as well, if even for a moment we catch wind of the fact that we've been estimating and we want to break out of that, we're not necessarily sure that the person to whom we are about to confess isn't also caught up in that. And I think
That's right.
that's a real, I have in my life at different points, I have tried to confess things to certain people. And when I was not mature enough to realize that confession not only is for your freedom, but the person to whom you confess
Hmm.
needs to be able to handle what it is you're about to tell them. And I've sadly have hurt some people by putting things on them that they didn't know what to do with. Um,
Mm.
but I would say that if we get caught in this estimating pattern and we don't realize that's what we're doing, then we can very easily assume that God treats us the same way we treat other people. And so I
Yeah.
think that might be where you get the team bigness within the Christian, well, I treat other people with great respect when they are worthy of my respect. And if God's going to give me respect, that's probably because I've earned it somehow.
Mm. Yeah. Right.
And he's
Mm.
treating me as my righteousness deserves. And,
Mm. Yeah.
and yet, because I do, I think you talking about ditches the way you have is so great, because Jesus calls us to walk this narrow path, and it's a path with Him who didn't belittle Himself, but did not
Yeah.
look for praise and honor. I mean, He was, hey,
Yeah.
I'm going to give you, I'm going to restore or cleanse you from this leprosy, and I just want you to go and offer your sacrifice at the temple. You don't need to tell anybody about this.
Mm.
That's not what I'm interested in right here. I'm interested in setting you free and getting you back to your family,
That's
um,
beautiful.
which is so
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and it's interesting too. Jesus, he fights against both ditches. I mean, some people, like the woman at the well, or the woman who's accused of adultery, he lifts up. This person views themselves really low, and so he builds them up. And then other people, like the Pharisees, he tears down because they're arrogant. And so you see him fighting against both of these ditches, and it's beautiful to me.
absolutely. And I think when you carry around this idea that as you put it, that your security is earned, then you do have all the reason in the world to look at other people who have not attained to the same level of goodness as you,
Yeah.
and you feel justified. I mean, you feel justified in snubbing them. You feel justified, or I am holding up God's standards by not extending kindness to you in this moment because you don't deserve it. Um, and if
Mm.
I could back up just to talk about that point, I had highlighted this on page 88 when you listed another little chart on your estimating chapter. You had said the difference between estimating and humility, where we're not earning our security, but security is given to us by Jesus.
Mm.
And then you said in the estimating world, everything is considered for what it says about the self. And in humility, everything is considered only for the thing itself. And
Yeah.
I would say that if there was one point in this entire book that has captured me more than any other, it's that one right there.
Mm.
I have lived most of my life with a very strong perfectionistic tendencies, which I now know are rooted in insecurities
Yeah.
and thinking that I have to earn it, or I have to see so many, I have to win an argument, or I have to offer a suggestion to somebody, and my suggestion is seen as the best suggestion. And
Mm.
if they reject my suggestion, I don't know what it was. Maybe just insecurity is the best way I can say it, but I would interpret them not accepting my suggestion as a rejection of me. And so I would not offer opinions about what I thought about things for fear that they wouldn't love the opinion. And then it would simply confirm to me that I'm a guy who doesn't know how to give good opinions.
Oh man.
I mean, I
Oh.
sound like a dysfunction just talking out loud to get it out, but I'm all about it, man. Let's air the
Yeah.
weaknesses. Paul says when you do that, there's some resurrection power to be had. So I'm going for it. But it was just a couple months ago, and I had a conversation. My son spilled some ink on his jeans, and my wife got upset because she always tells our kids, "You're doing crafts, don't wear your nice clothes," this kind of thing.
Oh no.
So I get online, I look it up, and somebody's telling me, or maybe it wasn't ink, it might have been like rubber cement or something like that. Anyway, I looked up an article first thing, and it says, use petroleum jelly and rub it into the stain and then rinse it off. And she goes, "That's not going to work." And she gives me, this real intelligent response about why petroleum jelly would be the worst thing to use. And I'm telling you, Dan, I'm standing there, I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, I'm just trying to help. Why do you always have to? But I remembered your statement here in your book, and I was like, she's not rejecting me. She's
That's right.
just rejecting the idea that this patrol. So I was like, okay, let's look for something else. And I did. And I'm telling you, it sounds so silly to mention this on the air, right? Like, oh, a guy who's a pastor of a church ought to have his life together. But emotionally speaking, I didn't. And I,
Mm,
am just coming into that in my 40s. So there it is. But that entire
mm.
potential conflict, right? And you talk about competition versus conflict, and if somebody's got to win, then you turn a potential conflict, which could just be an opportunity to grow and an opportunity to learn something new and an opportunity to come closer together, turns into a competition where you're
That's
fighting
right.
with each other. And man, I've lost count how many times I've argued with my wife about it. Well, you're just rejecting you're just rejecting me. And she's like, I'm not rejecting you. I
Yeah.
just don't agree with your idea.
Yeah.
And
Well, hey, I tell you that I've learned some hard lessons on the conflict competition stuff in
wow.
my own life, and
Yeah.
also you're in great company, learning crucial life things in your 40s. Just last fall, I had this very embarrassing um, interaction with somebody I work with at Woodland Hills, where I basically acted like a toddler and said some really mean things, and I had to explore that and figure out why the heck did I. It was like it wasn't even me. It was like something else inside of me,
Mm,
and so man, that's what's great about being brothers and sisters in Christ and being in the kingdom of God is we can all grow together, and that's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
yeah. Well, do you have those examples of some competition or conflict, or how you see those relating to each other?
Well, absolutely. I mean, some I can't remember specifics because maybe because there are so many of them, but definitely when you're in seminary and you read C.S. Lewis and you want to be the next C.S. Lewis, and which is funny because everybody wants to be C.S. No one wants to be Mother Teresa. Isn't that something? You
Isn't
know,
that
we
something?
Yeah, we all want to be the one who has the best arguments, and so you go to seminary and you're just like, no, I have to be right, and in order for me to be effective, I have to be right, and so it's just every there's so many interactions that become competitive like that, and I didn't really untap a lot of this stuff until maybe even after seminary, and so I wish I could go back because I
Yeah.
was pretty arrogant in seminary,
Wow.
and and at that point too, that's when I started to realize how lucky I was to teach in a college and be friends with Paul Eddy and to know Greg Boyd, and that stuff went to my head, and so yeah, I absolutely have been down that path, and I went to a like a coffee party with some former seminary students like 8 years after seminary, and somebody was leaving who I went to seminary with, and she said goodbye. And I came in, and the host of the party said hello, and I said, "Oh, who was that? I forgot her name." And I think she said it was like Laura or something. And I said, "Oh yeah, yeah, I always liked being in class with her in seminary." And the host of the party said, "Oh, she was just saying that she thought you were arrogant." It's like, ow, ouch. And then I had
Yep.
to realize, she's right. I really was. I was very arrogant back then. And
Wow.
so yeah, man, it's a path. It's a journey.
Yeah, it really
So
is.
hey, let me
Well, Dan, this is
hey,
yeah.
in that spirit, let me say this really quick.
Yeah.
If you do meet authors that, like if you meet Greg or if you meet whoever, like NT Wright or whoever, don't let my book keep you from telling them what their book means to you, because, and I'm saying this to your listeners also,
Yeah.
because man, NT Wright and Greg and Paul Eddy and the people I've been around who have written these books, they have worked so hard and they have put so much of themselves into it that
Yeah.
if you're not exalting them, but you're just telling them what the book means, that is a
Yeah.
way of paying them for, because they don't make much money. So
Wow.
that's payment for them to tell them what the book means. And so I would encourage you to keep doing that. Just don't exalt them, because they don't
Yeah.
want that, nor do they deserve that.
Absolutely. No, and that's a great line, and I think that is the line. That is the humility, is that we're brothers, and to a brother, what would I say? I would say
Yeah,
thank you. You have
that's
served
right.
me well. You have given me a perspective that has radically changed my relationship with Jesus, and is going to continue to bear fruit till the day I die. Thank you. And
Amen.
I think I just, to be able to put it in those terms
Amen.
is rich. And I hope someday to meet them. I don't push away from it because I don't want to jump to the other ditch and say, well, I was into, hero worship and now I'm into hero, spitting. And no, I'm not.
That's right.
I love these men and women and want to
Yeah.
continue to learn from them. So Dan, this has
Amen.
been just fantastic. And for our listeners, I'm just glad that they got a chance to hear you. It's like I said to you earlier, it's funny. I've been hearing your voice for hours and hours and hours. It's been nice to interact with you a little bit myself as I listen to your podcast with Greg, and I'll make a link to that podcast in our show notes, as well as the Amazon link for the book. Again, Confident Humility, Becoming Your Full Self Without Becoming Full of Yourself. And Dan, that is a fantastic subtitle. And I think it just spells out exactly what they'll find in between the covers. So are there any final things you want to leave us with that have surfaced?
Well, I think that pretty much covers it. I don't even know what we've covered anymore. So we've
Well,
kind
I
of been
think,
all over the place. So
yeah, we
it was
have.
very fun. It was very
Yeah,
fun.
we have. It was very much fun. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And I just wish you the best at your church and your ministry and continue your podcast. And just know I'm definitely tuning in, and hopefully others will begin if they've never come across it yet. And thanks for taking the time, Dan. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Joshua. And I look forward to talking to you some more. So I really do, man. I love what you're doing with your podcast, and I love your just listening to the little bit that I've listened to. Man, I love your tone. I love your careful thought, and I just think that you're doing really good things. So keep it up, and I look forward to seeing what happens with your podcast.
I really appreciate that. All right. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
What an absolutely refreshing conversation that was with Dan Kent. And I hope that each of you got even a fraction of the value of that conversation that I happened to get just in talking with Dan and spending time with him over the phone. And so I cannot recommend Dan's book, Confident Humility, highly enough. Please go to Amazon or go wherever you buy books and pick up a copy of that book. I do want to let you know that in the show notes of this episode, I am trying to make a link available for you to go to Dan's website, because Dan has released for free a PDF of a workbook that is meant to pair perfectly with the book Confident Humility. And my encouragement to you, now that you've listened to our initial conversation about this, would be to gather a group of friends, maybe from your church or those that you went to school with or friends in your community, and get the copy of the book, Confident Humility. And as you read it, work through the workbook together with your group of friends. This is not something that should be done by yourself. And that's why even having a conversation with two people is so much richer than you just being able to listen to me attempt to explain things to you on the podcast. And so I'm really excited for Dan. I hope that his book sales increase even a little. I know we don't have a huge listening audience on this show, but we have some who tune in. And then I want to let you know as well that beginning on Saturday morning, June 20th, Dan himself is starting an online class through Zoom that's going to take several weeks, going through the book as well and bringing up new insights and things that the Lord is teaching him as he continues to work his way through this book. And there is a cost to that is up to you as the participant. You can give a little bit, you can give a lot in support of what Dan's trying to do, but I'm going to leave a link in the show notes for a way to register for that class as well. So Dan, you're a gift. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your kindness, and just for reaching out, offering resources to Christians, and just for the total blast we had on the phone. It was really a delight. And so I'm thankful to you as well, listeners who continue to tune in. Look for another By the Book episode in several weeks from now. Starting next week, we'll return back to the Revelation series and continue to see what Jesus has to teach us there. But thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for those who maybe even jumped in just in this episode. It's nice to have you as part of the podcast, and hopefully we'll be able to connect sometime in the future. That's all for this week. See you next time.